Welcome to another episode of Defending the Line. I'm Christy Shepard, and this is my podcast to share the story of what happened in the murder of my cousin Debbie Carter in our small Oklahoma town, and how finding out that the two men convicted of that crime were innocent turned into a quest for truth and accountability. We finished off episode 6 with Glen Gore's prison escape. So on the same day that we watched Williamson and Fritz disappear into the sunset with their families, along with them went everything that we thought we knew about Debbie's case. And we'd found out in open court with the rest of the town that there, in fact, was a DNA match. That it was the very man that had actually last been seen with Debbie. That it was a man that she'd gone to high school with. Turns out that this man was also the only eyewitness claiming to have seen Williamson bothering Debbie the night that she was murdered. The very man who refused to testify in court. And now we've learned that this man, who is a violent criminal, has escaped from prison. And so on the same afternoon of April the 15th of 1999, the headline read, "Suspect linked to DNA escapes from prison. Inmate distraught over Carter's case." And I'm not really sure. I guess they're talking about Gore there, that he's the one that, the inmate that's distraught over Carter. That always kind of confused me. But the article explains that the gag order had been placed on the case to protect Gore's identity during the hearing. Even though Williamson and Fritz's attorneys wanted that information released because they felt like it would protect Williamson and Fritz. And no one saw fit to tell anyone in Debbie's family anything that was going on. Not even a heads up before anyone else in the town found out. And I understand that Gore had protections under the law as far, a fair trial and things like that, but it was always very hurtful that we never knew anything until everyone else did, and in some cases afterwards, depending on, who read the paper first. So the DA's statements just 4 days earlier about not knowing who matched the DNA wasn't true. And the district attorney had stood in the office, in the lobby of his office, just minutes before we went into court and lied straight to our faces. That they didn't know who it matched, that, I was trying to understand, was there 3 now? I mean, how all this fit together. And later I asked Judge Landreth, before he retired, I asked him about this decision to place a gag order on the case and why no one in Debbie's family was told anything about it. And the explanation that he gave me was that also he was trying to minimize this whole circus event that was growing, by the second. And I really, in his answer, I really felt like it was heartfelt, that he really felt like he was, doing the right thing. But again, there was no consideration for her family, for, what this was going to do to us, how this was going to affect everything. So how did this DNA match even come to be? Well, the DNA profile of the hairs and the semen in Debbie's case was uploaded into what they call the CODIS system. And so, like most states, Oklahoma uploads into a DNA, uploads the DNA samples of prison population. When you go into prison, you have it, you get a swab done, and the state uploads that sample into this CODIS system, or what's called it's the Combined DNA Index System. And it's a national DNA database that's maintained by the FBI. And so when the semen samples and the hair samples collected in Debbie's case, and what was collected in her apartment didn't match Williamson and Fritz during this initial testing, those samples were then uploaded into the CODIS system, and there was a hit. So nationwide, one single match was linked to an Oklahoma prisoner who was, again, the last person seen with her. And that man was identified as prisoner number 153663, which was Glen Gore. And you might be wondering, why was Gore even in prison initially for his sample to be in the system? Well, from what I understand, I guess he had been in trouble off and on, but what landed him in prison at this particular time was an event that had happened with his ex-wife, where he had kidnapped her and her 4-year-old child. And I guess when the police was called, he actually used this small child as a human shield to shoot at the police. I believe hitting one of the officers, or some debris or something from the gunshot anyway, injured an officer. And he went to prison for that incident. So in that evening, when the article came out, it had also stated that Gore had made a plea deal 1 week prior to becoming a witness against Williamson and Fritz. And that plea deal was this 40-year sentence, which I'm gathered later on that I don't guess he was too happy about it. Maybe that was the reason that he refused to testify. I don't know. But the kidnapping charge and the assault with dangerous weapon charges were dropped. And we also learned from the newspaper that Gore's prints were never compared to the ones found in Debbie's apartment. The prints that were so important that they dug up her body to obtain these prints 5 years after her murder, and reevaluate those prints and change the original report. And we also learned that there were no forensics on any of Gore's samples that were taken at a particular time, and we'll talk more about that later as well. There were no forensics to determine whether or not he was or wasn't what they call a non-secretor. And this issue of a non-secretor was very important in the original investigation of Williamson and Fritz, because both Williamson and Fritz were found to be non-secretors. And what that is, the way that I understand it, is that a person who is a non-secretor doesn't secrete their body type antigens into their body fluids, or I guess that if you're a non-secretor, you don't secrete your blood type. That's what I meant. That you don't secrete your blood type into your body fluids like saliva and semen. So the semen that was found at the scene originally, because they didn't have DNA then, it was determined that it came from a non-secretor, and both Williamson and Fritz were non-secretors. But that forensics test was never done on any sample that Gore had given, and we learned that from the paper. So Gore was found to match this DNA in 1999. But for reasons no one can really has ever been able to explain, he wasn't charged until April of 2001. So almost exactly 2 years later to the day. And then another year would pass, and in August 2002, Gore was arraigned for Debbie's murder. So again, Peppy would be faced with reliving every detail of how her daughter was raped and murdered. And this time, there was one man instead of two. And this time, there was new science that linked, this someone else to the evidence that was left behind. An article in the newspaper quoted Gore's attorney by saying, "Prosecutors publicly said Fritz and Williamson were guilty, and that some poor schmo had consensual sex right before the murder took place. That poor schmo is Mr. Gore." Then the special prosecutor was quoted at firing back at Gore's lies. "Again, there is nothing about Debbie other than her name and the obscene way she died," in this article. And all too often, I feel like women are blamed for the crimes that are committed against them. And it was clear in this article that Gore's defense would be no different. That Debbie would be portrayed as this loose barmaid who had consensual sex with a guy. She really never socialized with, in the back of a honky-tonk on a Tuesday night. And originally, that was talked about by the district attorney in the efforts to stick to their original narrative. And so by now, Ron Williamson and Dennis Fritz were free men, and we were even further away from justice than in 1982 when Debbie was murdered. By now, the Detective Smith, has retired. The district attorney, Peterson, has recused himself from anything having to do with the case. And Debbie's case now would be handled by a special appointed assistant district attorney from the Oklahoma Attorney General's office. His name was Richard Winery. And he would be assisted by the still assistant district attorney here in our county, Chris Ross. And it was also along about this time that Williamson and Fritz had settled a civil suit. It was documented that Williamson and Fritz had filed a $100 million civil suit. And the suit named several individuals and agencies in the state of Oklahoma, the sheriff of Pontotoc County, the police chief, the city of Ada, Detective Smith, agents with the OSBI, individual sheriff's deputies, and there were, a handful of others. By the time that a settlement was agreed to, most of the agencies and individuals were dropped from the suit. And in the end, the city of Ada and the state would pay it. And the city's settlement of, the portion of their portion of the lawsuit had been announced earlier in the year. Right about the same time actually on the same afternoon Gore was being arraigned for murder. It was announced that the city had, settled their portion of the lawsuit, which was, I don't know if that was ironic or purposeful. I don't know. The city had agreed to pay over $500,000 that would come from a self-insurance fund. The state's portion of the civil suit would be paid out of an insurance policy with AIG. Now, the final sum that was paid to Williamson and Fritz was said to have been much less than $100 million. Rumor mill was that each of them received around $7 million when it was all said and done, but no one will ever know for sure because the terms of that settlement are sealed from the public. And it never really sat well with me, the fact that the settlement was sealed, because I've yet to understand how it is acceptable to conceal monies paid out by the citizens of Oklahoma for wrongdoing of individuals who are not only employed by the state, but were also represented themselves on behalf of the state and on behalf of Oklahomans. So the sealing of the settlement actually turns out to be one of the many troubling things that came from the civil suit. And about the time that I guess the civil suit was wrapping up, Glen Gore's trial would begin. And I did not attend this trial. I worked out of town at the time, and I was actually just weeks away from having my second baby. And so in May of 2003, jury selection began. And it had been around about 4 years since Williamson and Fritz walked out of the same courtroom Gore now would be tried in. Debbie had been dead more than 20 years. And my family was about to go to trial for the third time. And it would be the same torn green panties, the same bloody washcloth, the same broken glass on the landing of the stairs, the same hair, the same semen. And Peppy and the rest of my family, the rest of Debbie's family, would sit again for more than 2 weeks trying to wrap their minds around having to be there again. And everything was the same, except the defendant. The same witnesses were called. Debbie's friend, again, recounted finding her body. Debbie's dad recounted going up the stairs to his daughter's apartment. Debbie's other friend recounted again the phone calls that she made to her that evening. But there was testimony from a witness this time that had not been heard from before. A gentleman with the last name of West. And he had stated that he had given Gore a ride home, leaving the coach lot the night of December the 8th of 1982. That they had went to breakfast at this restaurant called the Waffler, which was actually it's about 2 blocks from where Debbie's apartment was. And that they had went, around 1:30 that morning. But then Gore had asked Mr. West to give him a ride back across town to go to his mother's house. But then suddenly wanted to be dropped off in the middle of the road in the middle of the night when it was freezing, just on the side of the road. And so Mr. West explained in his testimony that he had not lived in Ada in many years, and that he had never been contacted by Detective Smith or anyone associated, with investigating Debbie's case about attending the coach lot that night. And there weren't that many people there. And he recalled that there was only a few people there, but he did not see Williamson there that night. And Mr. West explained that his concern was that he too had learned of Glen Gore's connection with the case on the radio, and became, very worried that, thinking back, like, oh my gosh, he left with me that night, and what if they thought I was involved or something? And so Mr. West presented himself and, came back to Ada and recalled for the police what had happened. No one had ever reached out to him. He actually did that of his own accord. He wanted the police and them to know that Gore had left the club with him that night and exactly where he dropped him off. And, what exactly his involvement was that night. And he'd never been contacted before. Not even in the 2-3 years between the time that Williamson and Fritz are found innocent and the time that, Gore's going to trial. And so Gore's attorney explained that, Debbie and Gore were friends and that they'd known each other since high school and that they had shared a special relationship. It's quoted as a special relationship. And he further stated that Gore had come to the police station of his own free will the day after Debbie was murdered or, found, and provided, willingly and voluntarily provided hair and saliva samples. And there was also a Dr. Fred Jordan who had performed Debbie's autopsy. And he testified that in the original case file that it was missing. And that was the first time in his 31-year career that had ever happened. And still there's no explanation. To my knowledge, it's never been found. And a couple of different experts during this trial had concluded that the DNA testing on the hair found at the scene that matching nuclear and mitochondrial DNA increases the likelihood that the hair is from the same person, and with that person being Glen Gore. And during this trial, we would also find out a little bit more about this prison escape. So a woman by the name of Angela Flores testified that she had been a longtime friend of Gore's, and that she was the one he called to pick him up off I-35 when he was doing his work on the work site. She stated that they went to breakfast at McDonald's, and then they went to her apartment and they got into an argument. And she added that Glen doesn't have a mean bone in his body. She just picked up a prisoner off of the interstate. So, just a few days, after the trial began, it was wrapping up, and it took the jury less than 2 hours to find Gore guilty of first-degree murder. The special prosecutor, Winery, was quoted in the newspaper saying, "This shows that trials are still about truth, and they're still about justice." I'm going to have to read that one again and let that soak in for a minute. So this shows that trials are still about truth, and they're still about justice. And the assistant district attorney, Ross, was quoted saying that although it took 20 plus years, justice finally caught up with Glen Gore. And Ross was also quoted as explaining that a reinvestigation, over the course of prosecuting this case, we found more and more evidence and witnesses that completely convinced us that Fritz and Williamson were not involved. And on the next day, after closing arguments, the lawyers were at it again. And this time it was for the sentencing phase. And the state was seeking the death penalty for Glen Gore, just like they had done Williamson and Fritz years before. And for my family, the death penalty was the only acceptable punishment. The special prosecutor, Winery, stated he, talking about Gore, is the one that chose. You're to determine the fate of his choices. Don't lose sight of what blood, her body, her injuries are telling you what he chose to do. And finished it with, take the family who has endured the trials of two men decades later and are having to be here today. The darkness of their night could be no darker. You light a candle for them with your verdict. You lit a candle for them with your verdict yesterday. And finding out that some of the things that I found out later on in the case makes those quotes even harder to even read out loud. But also during the sentencing phase, the jury heard from Gore's ex-wife, the one that he had kidnapped. And she said, I truly thought we were going to die. I had accepted the fact that I was going to die. I didn't want him to kill me in front of my daughter. And jurors also heard from Gore's family and his abusive, upbringing that he had had. And they heard from other women that he had raped. And they heard again from, victims' impact statements from Debbie's dad and her mom. And again, we had been promised justice by lethal injection, and the jury delivered. So 10 women and 2 men came back with an unanimous decision to send Glen Gore to death row. And Pepe said, I was very happy with the verdict. I think justice has been served and Debbie can rest now. And in all this craziness, it did seem to feel like it was done about that time. It felt like if the subject of Debbie came up, that we weren't only talking about those last few hours of her life. There was, a few times that my family was talking about memories of her, funny things. And I remember, one time there was no discussion when we were all talking about her. There was no discussion of Williamson or Fritz or Gore or court or anything. And there had also been this connection made during this time. That in all this craziness, Pepe got a phone call. And Debbie's younger sister was there to actually hear it as well. But Pepe got a phone call. And when she picked up the phone, the man on the other end said, Peggy, this is Ronnie Williamson. And I want you to know I didn't kill your daughter. And Pepe was floored. She could not believe that he was calling her. And she said, I know you didn't. And they began to have this relationship on the phone. And I believe that Ron lived out of state at that time. But they began to have this relationship over the phone where he would call her on occasion and they would just talk. And Pepe really has a, country southern drawl, and she would, she calls everyone like hun and sugar, and she would refer to him and say, oh, hun, and he said, at one time he asked her, he said, what did you call me? And she said, oh, I'm sorry. That's just how I talk to everybody. And he said, no, I like it when you talk to me like that. And so they would just, like I said, they would just visit, and he would call at random times and they would talk. And we would find out later that he never told anyone. He never told his attorneys. He never told his sisters. And then on December the 7th of 2004, Pepe actually called one of his sisters. She called his sister Annette, but his sister Renee had answered the phone. And she had called his sisters to extend her condolences and apologies that she had found out by reading the newspaper that Ron Williamson had passed away. And she wanted them to know, how sorry she was. And that she really, had enjoyed his phone calls. And, how much it meant to her that he had called. And later when I met Ron's sister, she explained, told the story and how she just had a total breakdown when she got off the phone with my aunt, because she had no idea that they had become, friends. And Pepe actually went a few days after, I guess, he passed away, and went to the cemetery and tried to find where he was laid to rest to put flowers out for him, but she never could find his plot. And also later, when I had talked to Ron's sister, she said that they had not buried Ron in the same cemetery as Debbie out of respect for her. And that always touched my heart, because after all that he'd been through, and after all their family had been through, they thought of Debbie and how that would affect us. And I think how sad it was that this family, who owed us nothing, thought more about her than the people who had been tasked to seek justice in her name. So Ronald Keith Williamson died of cirrhosis of the liver in a nursing home on December the 4th of 2004. He had experienced 5.5 years of freedom. But those years of freedom had not liberated Ron from his demons with mental illness. And the 12 years on death row had only exacerbated the noise in his head. And so, oddly enough, Ron was buried on December the 7th of 2004, exactly 22 years to the day after Debbie had last been seen alive. And I mentioned in one of the previous episodes how it doesn't snow often in this part of Oklahoma. And the day that Debbie was laid to rest, it snowed. And I don't know, it seems kind of like it was, God's hand. I don't really know, but that Ron too was laid to rest under this silent symphony of snow. And even though they never knew one another in life, the lives of Debbie Carter and Ron Williamson will forever be tied together. So in the next episode, we'll talk about how Debbie's case always seemed to cycle every few years. It's never quite long, and it feels like there's always a cloud of unfinished business. So you can go to defendingtheline.com for other information and updates, as well as Defending the Line on Instagram. You can also watch these episodes on YouTube at Defending the Line. And as always, I thank you for listening.